The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the arid lands of New Mexico, creating heat waves that danced across the desolate landscape like silent ghosts. Ethan gazed at the infinite horizon from atop a century-old cactus, its deep roots bearing witness to generations that had come and gone. At 16, the boy had learned that life in the territory was harsh, but he never imagined it could be as cruel as he was about to discover. His bare feet found support on the thick spines of the giant plant, each movement calculated with the precision of someone who had climbed that same tree hundreds of times. It was his refuge, his place of dreams, where he could imagine a future different from what reality offered him. Orphaned since age 8, Ethan had learned to survive alone in the small cabin his parents left as their only inheritance, cultivating a modest garden and raising a few chickens that guaranteed his basic sustenance. That afternoon, while watching a merchant caravan approaching along the dusty road, something caught his attention. A group of men on horseback was following the caravan at a suspicious distance, their faces covered by bandanas and their intentions clearly hostile. Ethan knew the signs well, bandits preparing an ambush. Without hesitation, he began to quickly descend from the cactus to alert the travelers, but haste would be his downfall. A dry branch gave way under his weight, and the world spun in slow motion. The impact against the rocky ground echoed like dry thunder, and searing pain shot through his spine like a lightning bolt of fire. When the dust settled and consciousness returned, Ethan realized something was terribly wrong. His legs, which moments before had carried him with feline agility, now lay lifeless like dead branches. Cries for help echoed across the desert until Josiah Kane, an old gunslinger who lived as a hermit nearby, appeared mounted on his bay horse. Josiah was a living legend in the territory. They said his hands were faster than the wind and his eyes could see into men's souls. But at that moment, he was just an elderly man carrying an injured boy into a humble cabin. "Life has a peculiar way of teaching us its hardest lessons," murmured Josiah, while examining Ethan's motionless legs. "Sometimes, when we think we've lost everything, that's when we're about to find our true strength." The days that followed were a whirlwind of physical and emotional pain. Ethan discovered that the paralysis was permanent. His dreams of exploring distant territories, of building a prosperous life, of perhaps finding a family, all seemed to have been buried along with his ability to walk. The nights were the worst, when the desert silence amplified his dark thoughts, and the reality of his new condition hit him like relentless waves. Josiah remained by his side during the first weeks, caring for his basic needs and offering words of encouragement that initially sounded empty to Ethan's ears. The old gunslinger had seen much in his 60 years of life: wars, betrayals, deaths, births, and knew that Ethan's real battle was just beginning. "Son," said Josiah one morning while preparing coffee over the fire, "I've seen men with strong legs who were more crippled than you'll ever be. A man's strength isn't in his muscles, but in his determination to continue when everything seems lost." Ethan wanted to believe those words, but bitterness had taken deep root in his heart. He spent his days watching through the window, seeing life continue outside while he remained trapped in his own flesh. The chickens continued pecking in the yard, the sun continued rising and setting, but for Ethan, time had stopped at that terrible moment of the fall. It was during one of those melancholic afternoons that something extraordinary happened. Trying to reach a book that had fallen, Ethan dragged himself across the cabin floor and noticed that one of the floorboards was loose. Moved by curiosity, the first positive emotion he'd felt in weeks, he managed to lift the wood and discovered a hollow space underneath. His hands trembled when they found an object wrapped in oiled cloth. It was a diary, its pages yellowed by time and moisture but still legible. On the cover, in delicate handwriting he immediately recognized, was written, "For my dear Ethan, may the truth set you free when you're ready to carry it." Ethan's heart raced. It was his mother's handwriting, Sarah, who had died 8 years ago in a supposed stagecoach accident along with his father. His hands shook so much he could barely open the diary, but when he did, the first words hit him like a punch to the stomach. If you're reading this, my son, it means something terrible has happened to us, and that Thorn finally got what he wanted. Thorn. The name echoed in Ethan's mind like a funeral bell. Baron Marcus Thorn, the railroad magnate who controlled half the territory, a man respected and feared in equal measure. But what connection could he have with his parents' death? With trembling hands, Ethan continued reading. Each page revealed a more shocking truth than the last. His mother described in detail how Thorn had coveted the family's land for years, land that contained not only fertile soil, but also a silver vein that could be worth a fortune. Purchase attempts had been repeatedly refused, and Thorn had resorted to darker methods. He offered money, then veiled threats, and finally direct threats, wrote Sarah. Yesterday we discovered he forged documents claiming our property was legally purchased by him years ago. When we confronted the local judge, we found out he's also in Thorn's pocket. We're planning to travel to the territorial capital to report this fraud, but I'm afraid Thorn won't let us get there alive. Tears blurred Ethan's vision, but he continued reading compulsively. His mother had documented everything. Names of witnesses Thorn had bribed or intimidated, copies of forged documents, even details about the hired guns the Baron employed to do his dirty work. But the most devastating revelation was in the last pages. Sarah had discovered that Marcus Thorn wasn't just a greedy criminal, he was Ethan's father's younger brother, Thomas. Thorn was his uncle, a man who had grown up with envy and resentment toward his older brother, who had inherited the family lands while he was left with nothing. Marcus was always consumed by envy, wrote Sarah. He believed he deserved the family inheritance, and when our marriage brought even more prosperity to Thomas, his bitterness turned into pure hatred. He doesn't just want our land, he wants to destroy everything his brother built, including our son. Ethan closed the diary forcefully, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he processed the magnitude of what he had discovered. His parents hadn't died in an accident. They had been murdered by his own uncle, a man he had seen from afar on a few occasions, always impeccably dressed and surrounded by an aura of power and respectability. The rage that sprouted in his chest was different from anything he had ever felt. It was a flame that burned cold and steady, fueled not only by thirst for revenge, but by a deep sense of justice. His parents had died trying to do the right thing, and their sacrifice could not be in vain. When Josiah returned from his weekly trip to town for supplies, he found Ethan transformed. The boy he had left was a broken and hopeless young man. What he found was a man with purpose, his eyes shining with an iron determination that the old gunslinger immediately recognized. "You discovered something," said Josiah. It wasn't a question. Ethan told him everything, showing the diary and watching the expressions on Josiah's weathered face change from surprise to anger, and finally, to dark resolution. The old gunslinger had known Ethan's parents, and had always suspected their death hadn't been accidental. "Thorn is powerful," said Josiah after a long silence. "He has judges, sheriffs, and politicians in his pocket. It won't be easy to bring him down." "I don't care if it's easy or hard," replied Ethan, his voice carrying a maturity he hadn't possessed weeks before. "He killed my parents and stole our land. He needs to pay for it." Josiah studied the young man's face for a long moment. "Revenge is a dangerous road, son. It can consume a man completely, leaving only ashes where once there was a soul." "It's not revenge," corrected Ethan. "It's justice. There's a difference." The old gunslinger nodded slowly. "Yes, there is. And if it's justice you seek, then you'll need to be smarter than Thorn, more patient than him, and more determined than any man he can hire to stop you. Will you help me?" Josiah looked at Ethan's motionless legs, then at his burning eyes. "Son, you may not be able to walk, but I can teach you to fight in ways Thorn will never imagine. The mind is the most powerful weapon a man can possess, and yours is sharp as a razor." That night, while the fire crackled in the fireplace and the desert wind whistled through the cabin's cracks, Josiah began Ethan's first lesson in an education very different from what any school could offer. He would learn about strategy, about observation, about how to read people and discover their weaknesses. Most importantly, he would learn about patience, the most difficult virtue for a young man thirsty for justice. Thorn built his empire on lies and fear, explained Josiah. But every empire built on rotten foundations eventually crumbles. Our job is to find the cracks and apply pressure in the right places. Ethan absorbed every word like a dry sponge absorbs water. His physical disability, which initially seemed like a curse, began to reveal itself as an unexpected advantage. No one would suspect a paralyzed young man. No one would see him as a threat. He could move through Thorn's world like a shadow, observing and collecting information without arousing suspicion. The weeks turned into months, and Ethan's education continued. Josiah taught him to shoot with deadly precision, using only his arms, transforming his handcrafted wheelchair into a stable shooting platform. More importantly, he learned the art of investigation, how to follow clues, how to ask the right questions to the right people. His first mission was simple: find out more about the men who worked for Thorn. Using his harmless appearance, Ethan began frequenting the local tavern where railroad workers gathered after long journeys. Sitting in a dark corner, he listened to conversations, memorized names and faces, and slowly began mapping Thorn's corruption network. It was during one of these reconnaissance expeditions that Ethan heard something that made his blood freeze. Two of Thorn's hired guns were discussing a recent job, intimidating a farming family that refused to sell their land. The methods described were brutal and effective, and Ethan realized the same pattern had been used against his parents years before. "The boss doesn't like it when people say no," laughed one of the men. "Remember that couple a few years ago, the ones who died on the road? They also thought they could defy the Baron." The other man looked nervously around before responding. "Jake, you talk too much when you drink. Some things are better left buried." "Relax, Tom. Who's gonna hear us? A bunch of drunks and that crippled kid in the corner? He can barely move, let alone cause us trouble." Ethan maintained his neutral expression, but every word was burned into his memory like red-hot iron. Jake and Tom. Now he had names to put to the faces. More importantly, he had confirmation that his parents had been murdered, not killed in an accident. When he returned to the cabin that night, Ethan shared his discovery with Josiah. The old gunslinger nodded gravely. "Now you have witnesses, even if they don't know it yet. But we need more than tavern talk to bring down Thorn. We need solid evidence. Isn't my mother's diary enough? It's a start, but Thorn will say it's forged. We need something he can't deny. Official documents, witnesses willing to speak, physical evidence." Ethan spent the following night studying his mother's diary once more, looking for clues he might have missed. That's when he noticed a reference to a hidden safe in the law office where his father had kept important documents. If that safe still existed, it could contain the evidence they needed. The problem was that the office now belonged to one of Thorn's men, a corrupt lawyer named Silas Blackwood. Getting access to the safe would be nearly impossible, but Ethan was beginning to learn that nearly impossible wasn't the same as impossible. "There's always a way," said Josiah when Ethan shared his plan. "Sometimes it's straight, sometimes it's winding, but there's always a way for those determined enough to find it." Ethan smiled for the first time in months. His journey was just beginning, but he could feel he was on the right path. The truth was out there waiting to be discovered, and he would do whatever was necessary to bring it to light. That night, while watching the stars through his cabin window, Ethan made a silent promise to the parents he had lost. He would find the justice they had sought, no matter how long it took or what obstacles he faced. His paralysis wouldn't define him. His determination would. The first phase of his mission was complete. He had discovered the truth about his parents' death and identified his enemy. Now began the most dangerous part, gathering enough evidence to destroy one of the most powerful men in the territory. But Ethan was no longer afraid. He had found his purpose, and that gave him a strength no paralysis could take away. The following months transformed Ethan into something even he didn't recognize. Under Josiah's patient tutelage, he developed skills he had never imagined possessing. His mind, always sharp, became a tool of surgical precision, capable of analyzing complex situations and finding solutions where others saw only insurmountable obstacles. The first major opportunity arose when Ethan learned that Silas Blackwood, Thorne's corrupt lawyer, was looking for an assistant to organize his files. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. The young man seeking evidence against Thorne would work directly for one of his main accomplices. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to get so close to him that he can no longer see you, observed Josiah while helping Ethan prepare for the interview. Your condition will be your greatest advantage. Blackwood will see only a disabled young man needing work, not a threat. Ethan presented himself at Blackwood's office on an autumn morning, his clothes simple but clean, his expression humble but determined. The lawyer, a corpulent man with a graying mustache and small, calculating eyes, barely looked at him during the interview. "Can you read and write?" asked Blackwood, leafing through some papers on his desk. "Yes, sir. My parents taught me before the accident. And can you work long hours without complaining?" "Yes, sir. I need the job." Blackwood finally raised his eyes, studying Ethan with a mixture of disdain and pity. "Very well, you'll start tomorrow. Your job will be organizing files in the basement. The pay is low, but it's better than nothing for someone in your situation." Ethan swallowed the anger that rose in his throat and nodded humbly. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I won't disappoint you." The next day, Ethan descended the narrow stairs leading to the office basement, a damp and poorly lit space where decades of legal documents accumulated in disorganized piles. It was the perfect job for his purposes. Isolated, too tedious to attract constant supervision, and with access to potentially valuable information. During the first weeks, Ethan worked diligently, organizing documents by date and type, creating a system that impressed even Blackwood. But while his hands organized contracts and deeds, his eyes searched for something very specific, any document related to his parents' property or Thorne's questionable activities. It was during his third week on the job that Ethan made his first significant discovery. Hidden among routine contracts, he found a series of documents detailing the fraudulent transfer of his family's land to Thorne. The signatures were clearly forged, and the dates had been altered to make it appear the sale had occurred before his parents' death. But Ethan knew that simply stealing the documents wouldn't be enough. Blackwood would notice their absence, and Thorne could easily claim they were forgeries created by enemies. He needed a more subtle approach. Using skills Josiah had taught him, Ethan began making careful copies of the most incriminating documents, working during lunch when the office was empty. Each page was copied by hand with meticulous precision, preserving even the ink marks and spelling errors that could serve as evidence of authenticity. Meanwhile, his investigation expanded beyond Blackwood's office. On nights and weekends, Ethan visited taverns, markets, and other places where he could overhear conversations and collect information. His harmless appearance and growing ability to make people feel comfortable in his presence made him an effective spy. It was during one of these expeditions that Ethan met Maria Santos, a young Mexican woman whose family had been driven from their land by Thorne years before. Maria worked as a seamstress in town, but her eyes carried the same pain and determination that Ethan recognized in himself. "You're the boy who works for Blackwood," said Maria when Ethan approached her at the market. "Be careful who you trust. That man has blood on his hands." Ethan studied the young woman's face, seeing in her a possible ally. "You know Blackwood? I know what he did to my family. He forged documents that proved my father owed money to Thorne. When we couldn't pay, we lost everything." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "My father died of heartbreak 6 months later." "I'm sorry," said Ethan sincerely, "but maybe we can help each other. I'm collecting evidence against Thorne and Blackwood. If you know of other families who were harmed..." Maria studied him carefully. "Why would a boy like you care about this? You work for them." Ethan made a risky decision. "Because Thorne killed my parents and stole our land. And because I believe the truth always finds a way to the light, no matter how deeply it's buried." From that day on, Maria became a valuable ally. She knew other families who had been victims of Thorne, and slowly, Ethan began building a network of witnesses willing to speak when the right time came. But his most important investigation was happening in Blackwood's basement. After weeks of careful searching, Ethan finally found what he was looking for: a reference to the safe his mother had mentioned in her diary. According to an old document, the safe was located behind a bookshelf on the east wall of the basement. That night, after everyone had left the office, Ethan returned using a key he had copied weeks before. With his heart racing, he carefully moved the books from the indicated shelf and found a small opening in the wall. His hands trembled when they touched the cold metal of the hidden safe. The safe was locked, but Josiah had taught him some basic lock-picking skills. After 20 minutes of careful work, Ethan heard the satisfying click of the lock opening. The safe's contents exceeded his wildest expectations. There were original documents proving his family's legitimate ownership of the land, correspondence between Thorne and various corrupt officials, and most shocking of all, a written confession by Thorne himself, detailing his plans to eliminate Ethan's parents. The confession was in a letter addressed to one of his hired guns, instructing him on how to make the murder look like an accident. The words were cold and calculating, revealing a man completely devoid of conscience or remorse. "Thomas was always weak," wrote Thorne. "He was lucky to inherit the land that should have been mine by right, but his luck has run out. When he and his wife are dead, the land will return to the family, to me. The boy is too young to be a problem, and if he becomes one, he can have an accident too." Ethan had to stop reading for a moment, his vision blurred by rage and pain. Here was definitive proof that Thorne had not only killed his parents, but had also planned to kill him if necessary. The coldness of the words revealed a monster disguised as a respectable man, but there was more. The safe also contained evidence of Thorne's other criminal activities, bribes to judges, witness intimidation, even evidence that he had ordered the murder of a journalist who was investigating his activities. Ethan carefully copied all the documents, then replaced them in the safe exactly as he had found them. No one could know he had been there until it was time to reveal everything. When he returned to the cabin that night, Josiah was waiting with hot coffee and an expectant look. Ethan told him everything, showing the copies of the documents and watching the old gunslinger's face harden with each revelation. "This is more than enough to destroy Thorne," said Josiah finally. "But now comes the most dangerous part. How do you plan to use this information?" Ethan had thought a lot about this. "We can't just take everything to the local sheriff. He's in Thorne's pocket. We need to go higher, to someone Thorne can't buy or intimidate. The territorial governor," suggested Josiah. "He's based in the capital, far from Thorne's direct influence." "Exactly. But we need more than documents. We need witnesses willing to speak publicly, and we need a way to ensure our story is heard before Thorne can silence us." That's when Ethan had a brilliant idea. He had heard about a journalist from the capital who was investigating corruption in the territory, a man named William Hayes who had a reputation for integrity and courage. If they could convince Hayes to publish the story, it would be much harder for Thorne to suppress the scandal. "It's risky," observed Josiah. "If Thorne discovers what you're doing before the story is published, he'll kill me," completed Ethan calmly, "just like he killed my parents. But if we do nothing, he'll continue destroying innocent lives. I can't live with that." Josiah studied the young man's determined face and nodded slowly. "Then we'll do this right. But first you need to learn to protect yourself. If we're going into the wolf's den, you need to be prepared to fight." The following weeks were intense. Josiah taught Ethan advanced shooting and combat techniques adapted to his condition. More importantly, he learned about strategy and timing, when to attack, when to retreat, how to use patience as a weapon. Meanwhile, Ethan continued working for Blackwood, maintaining his facade as a humble assistant while collecting even more evidence. Each day at the office was an exercise in self-control, forcing himself to smile and be respectful to men he knew were criminals. It was during this period that Ethan made a discovery that would change everything. While organizing some recent documents, he found correspondence between Blackwood and Thorne discussing a new problem, a farming family that refused to sell their land for railroad expansion. The family was the Morrisons, and Ethan knew they had 3 small children. According to the letters, Thorne was planning to use the same methods he had used against Ethan's parents, an accident. that would eliminate the entire family. Ethan realized he had reached a decision point. He could continue collecting evidence and wait for the perfect moment to act, or he could try to save the Morrison family, risking exposing his investigation prematurely. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting risks that logic tells us to avoid, he murmured to himself, remembering something Josiah had taught him. A man who isn't willing to risk everything for justice doesn't deserve to have it. That night, Ethan made his decision. He would warn the Morrisons about the danger, even if it meant accelerating his timeline and increasing the risks to himself. Some things were more important than personal safety, and protecting innocence was one of them. But first he needed to ensure his evidence was safe. If something happened to him, someone else would need to continue the fight for justice. Ethan spent the night making additional copies of all documents, hiding them in different locations to ensure at least some would survive if Thorne discovered his investigation. When the sun rose over the New Mexico desert, Ethan was ready for the next phase of his mission. The most dangerous part was just beginning, but he was no longer afraid. He had found his strength in weakness, his purpose in tragedy, and his courage in the need to protect others from the same pain he had suffered. The truth was finally ready to see the light of day, and not even Marcus Thorne's power would be enough to keep it in the shadows much longer. The morning Ethan decided to warn the Morrison family about the imminent danger dawned with a blood-red sky that seemed to foreshadow the events to come. He had spent the night awake, finalizing his preparations and ensuring all evidence was securely hidden in multiple locations. Josiah accompanied him on the journey to the Morrison farm, located a few miles from town. The old gunslinger had tried to dissuade him, arguing it was too risky to expose his investigation prematurely, but Ethan remained firm in his decision. "I can't let another family suffer what mine suffered," said Ethan, as his wheelchair navigated the uneven terrain. "If Thorne discovers I know about his plans, so be it. At least the Morrisons will be alive." When they arrived at the farm, they found John Morrison repairing a fence, while his wife, Ellen, tended to their 3 small children in the yard. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that made Ethan's heart tighten, reminding him of his own family before the tragedy. John Morrison was an honest, hard-working man with calloused hands and gentle eyes. When Ethan explained who he was and why he had come, Morrison's expression changed from confusion to alarm and finally to grim determination. "We always knew Thorne wanted our land," said Morrison after hearing the entire story. "He made several offers, each more generous than the last. When we refused the latest one, he said we might regret it." Ellen Morrison, a strong woman with blonde hair pulled back in a bun, held her children closer. "What should we do? We have nowhere to go, and this land is all we have." Ethan had thought about this during the entire journey. "You need to leave here temporarily until I can expose Thorne publicly. I have enough evidence to destroy him, but I need time to organize it properly." "What if you fail?" asked Morrison. "What if Thorne is too powerful to be brought down? Then at least you'll be alive to fight another day," replied Ethan. "But I won't fail. I promise you that." There was something in Ethan's voice, an unshakable conviction that convinced the Morrisons. They agreed to leave that very night, taking only essentials and hiding with relatives in a neighboring territory until it was safe to return. But when Ethan and Josiah returned to town, they discovered their visit to the Morrisons hadn't gone unnoticed. One of Thorne's hired guns had followed them, and now the Baron knew someone was interfering with his plans. "We have a problem," said Josiah when they arrived at the cabin and found signs that someone had been there. "They've been here looking for something." Ethan quickly checked his secret hiding places and sighed with relief to discover the evidence remained untouched. But the message was clear. Thorne knew he was being investigated, and now the race against time had officially begun. That night, while standing guard, Josiah made an observation that would change everything. "You know you can't go back to Blackwood's office. They'll be waiting for you." Ethan nodded. "I know, but maybe it's time to stop hiding in the shadows. I have enough evidence to destroy Thorne. Now I need to find a way to present it to the world." That's when Ethan remembered journalist William Hayes. If he could reach the capital and convince Hayes to publish the story, It would be much harder for Thorn to suppress the scandal, but the journey would be dangerous, especially now that Thorn knew he was being hunted. "It's a risky move," observed Josiah. "Thorn has men throughout the territory. They'll be looking for you. Then we'll have to be smarter than them," replied Ethan. "Do you know alternative routes to the capital?" Josiah smiled for the first time in days. "Son, I know trails in this territory that even the Indians have forgotten. If anyone can get you to the capital undetected, it's me." They departed before dawn, using a tortuous route through canyons and mesas that added days to the journey but kept them away from main roads where Thorn's men might be waiting. Ethan's wheelchair had been modified by Josiah for rough terrain, and although the journey was difficult, they made steady progress. During the journey, Ethan used the time to organize his evidence and prepare his presentation. He knew he would have only one chance to convince Hayes, and everything depended on how convincing he could be. On the third day of travel, they spotted the territorial capital on the horizon. Santa Fe was a growing city, with adobe buildings mixed with more modern wooden and brick structures. It was a symbol of the territory in transition, struggling between tradition and progress. William Hayes maintained his office in a modest building in the city center. When Ethan and Josiah arrived, they found a middle-aged man with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see through people. Hayes had built his reputation exposing corruption and defending the oppressed. Exactly the kind of man Ethan needed. "You're very young to be carrying this kind of burden," said Hayes after hearing Ethan's story and examining some of the evidence. "But these proofs are extraordinary. If they're authentic, they represent one of the biggest corruption scandals I've ever seen." "They're authentic," assured Ethan. "I would stake my life on them. In fact, I already am." Hayes studied the young man carefully. "Why are you doing this? You could simply disappear, start a new life somewhere else. Why risk everything for justice?" Ethan thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Because if I don't do this, who will? How many other families will suffer like mine did? Sometimes doing the right thing isn't a choice. It's an obligation." Hayes nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll publish your story. But you understand that once this comes out, there's no going back. Thorn will use all his power to destroy you. He already tried to destroy me when he killed my parents," replied Ethan. "The difference is that now I'm ready to fight back." The story was published 3 days later, spreading through the territory like wildfire in dry grass. The headline screamed from the front page, "Railroad Baron exposed as murderer and land thief." The details were devastating, each accusation supported by documentary evidence that Hayes had independently verified. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Families who had been victims of Thorn began coming forward, adding their own stories to the growing scandal. The territorial governor announced an official investigation, and federal prosecutors were sent to examine the evidence. But Thorn didn't stand idle. Using his remaining influence, he tried to discredit the story, claiming it was a conspiracy by envious enemies. More dangerously, he sent his hired guns to find and permanently silence Ethan. The hunt culminated in a dramatic confrontation in Santa Fe itself. Thorn, desperate and furious, appeared personally with a group of gunmen, determined to end the young man who had destroyed his empire. The confrontation took place in the town's main square, before hundreds of witnesses. Thorn, an imposing man dressed in expensive clothes, faced Ethan, who remained calm in his wheelchair, surrounded by Josiah and several citizens who had come to support him. "You destroyed everything I built," shouted Thorn, his composure finally broken. "You're just a crippled kid who doesn't know when to stop meddling where you don't belong." "I am the son of Thomas and Sarah," replied Ethan calmly, his voice carrying across the entire square. "And I'm here to ensure justice is done for the crimes you committed against them and against so many other innocent families." That's when Thorn made the revelation that would shock everyone present. "You want to know the truth, boy? I didn't just kill your parents. I was also responsible for your fall from that tree. You were getting too curious, asking too many questions. I sent my men to scare you, make you fall. The paralysis was just an unexpected bonus." The silence that followed was deafening. Thorne had just publicly confessed not only to murdering Ethan's parents, but also to his responsibility for the young man's paralysis. Hundreds of witnesses heard every word. "Did you hear that?" shouted Hayes, who was recording everything. "He confessed in front of all of us." Thorne realized his mistake too late. In his rage and desperation, he had destroyed any chance of denying his involvement in the crimes. The federal prosecutors, who were present in the crowd, immediately ordered his arrest. What followed was one of the most sensational trials in territorial history. Ethan testified with a dignity and strength that impressed everyone present, presenting his evidence with clarity and precision. One by one, Thorne's victims came forward, telling their stories of loss and suffering. Maria Santos testified about how her family had lost their land. The Morrisons, who had returned after Thorne's arrest, told about the threats they had received. Dozens of other families added their voices to the chorus of accusation. But it was Ethan's mother's diary that provided the most devastating evidence. Each page was read aloud in court, revealing the full extent of Thorne's conspiracy. When the prosecutor finished reading the last entry, there wasn't a person in the room who wasn't convinced of the defendant's guilt. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of murder, fraud, extortion, and a dozen other crimes. Thorne was sentenced to life in prison, his empire dismantled, and his properties confiscated to compensate his victims. But the biggest surprise came during the sentencing phase, when it was revealed that Thorne had left a will confessing all his crimes and expressing remorse for his actions. Apparently facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, he had finally found something resembling a conscience. In the will, Thorne revealed the location of hidden fortunes he had accumulated through his crimes, money that would be used to compensate his victims. More importantly, he officially confirmed that Ethan was his nephew and the legitimate heir to the family lands. The restitution ceremony was held in the same square where Thorne had made his public confession. Ethan, now recognized as the legitimate owner of vast land holdings, used his new wealth to establish a fund that would help other families who had been victims of corruption and injustice. True wealth isn't in what we possess, but in the good we can do with what we have, said Ethan during the ceremony, his words echoing through the gathered crowd. Josiah, now officially recognized as Ethan's guardian and mentor, remained by his side throughout the ceremony. The old gunslinger had found new purpose in his life, helping Ethan administer the fund and continue fighting for justice. Maria Santos became the fund's first beneficiary, receiving not only compensation for the land her family had lost, but also resources to establish her own business. She and Ethan developed a deep friendship based on shared experiences and a common commitment to justice. The Morrisons recovered their land and received additional compensation for the trauma they had suffered. John Morrison became one of Ethan's advisors, helping identify other families in need of assistance. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was Ethan's own. The young man who had begun as a broken and hopeless victim had become a symbol of hope and determination. His story spread throughout the territory and beyond, inspiring others to fight against injustice and never give up, no matter how impossible circumstances might seem. William Hayes wrote a book about Ethan's story, titled Justice on Wheels, the story of a young hero of the Old West. The book became a national bestseller, spreading the message that true strength comes not from the body, but from the spirit. Years later, when Ethan looked out the window of his new house, built on the site where his childhood cabin once stood, he often thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought him there. His paralysis remained, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it had become part of his strength, a constant reminder that the greatest victories often come from the greatest adversities. Sometimes we need to lose everything to discover who we really are, he would murmur to himself, echoing words Josiah had told him years before. And sometimes, our greatest weakness becomes our greatest strength. The foundation Ethan had established grew beyond his most optimistic expectations. The Thomas and Sarah Justice Fund, named in honor of his parents, had helped hundreds of families throughout the territory and neighboring states. Honest lawyers worked pro bono for the fund, Dedicated investigators exposed corruption schemes, and a growing network of volunteers ensured no cry for justice went unheard. Maria Santos had become more than a fund beneficiary. She was now its executive director, using her own experience of loss to help others facing similar situations. Her strength and compassion perfectly complemented Ethan's determination and wisdom, creating a partnership that multiplied both their impacts. "You know," said Maria one afternoon while reviewing pending cases, "sometimes I think Thorn, without knowing it, created something much more powerful than any empire he could have built. He created you." Ethan smiled, an expression that had become much more common in recent years. Maybe that was the real justice. He tried to destroy everything good in the world, but ended up creating something that would multiply that goodness far beyond what he could ever imagine. Josiah, now with completely white hair but still with eyes sharp as razors, spent his days teaching young people the skills he had passed on to Ethan, not just shooting and strategy, but wisdom, patience, and the importance of fighting for what's right. His informal school had produced a new generation of justice defenders who spread their influence throughout the territory. "The boy became a man," observed Josiah to Maria one afternoon, watching Ethan work with a group of orphan children the fund had taken under its protection. But more than that, he became a force of nature, a force for good. The final irony of Ethan's story came years later, when he learned that Marcus Thorn had died in prison, not from violence or disease, but apparently from remorse. According to the prison chaplain, Thorn had spent his last years writing letters of apology to all the families he had harmed, letters he never sent, but which revealed a man finally confronting the magnitude of his crimes. "He found his redemption in the end," said Ethan when he heard the news. "Maybe that's the most important lesson of all this, that it's never too late to choose to do what's right, even when it seems we've lost everything." The last entry in Ethan's personal diary, written on his 30th birthday, perfectly captured the extraordinary journey he had made. "Today marks 14 years since I fell from that tree and discovered my life had changed forever. At the time, I thought I had lost everything, my mobility, my dreams, my future, but now I realize that fall wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. I learned that true paralysis isn't in legs that don't move, but in a mind that refuses to dream. I learned that justice isn't something that happens to us, but something we create through our choices and actions. And I learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from overcoming our limitations, but from transforming them into our strength. My parents died seeking justice, and for years I thought my mission was to avenge their deaths. But I discovered that the true honor to their memory wasn't in revenge, but in continuing the fight they started. The fight for a world where truth prevails over lies, where the powerful cannot oppress the weak, and where every person has the chance to live with dignity. If I could speak to that 16-year-old boy who was about to fall from the tree, I would tell him, prepare yourself for the most difficult journey of your life. You will lose things you think are essential, but you will find things that are truly important. You will discover that real strength doesn't come from muscles, but from the heart. And you will learn that sometimes, to fly, we first need to learn how to fall. Life taught me that we are not defined by the things that happen to us, but by how we choose to respond to them. And I choose to respond with hope, with determination, and with the unshakable conviction that justice will always find a way to the light. When Ethan closed the diary that night, he looked out the window at the same horizon he had observed from the tree so many years before. But now, instead of dreaming of an uncertain future, he could see the legacy he had built, a network of hope that extended far beyond what his eyes could reach. The boy who had fallen from the tree had risen in a way he never could have imagined, and his story would continue inspiring others long after he himself became just a memory, proving that sometimes the most painful falls can lead to the highest flights. In the end, Ethan had discovered the deepest truth of all, that true freedom isn't in the ability to walk, but in the courage to stand up against injustice, no matter how impossible circumstances might seem. And that truth, like all important truths, had the power to transform not just one life, but the entire world. If you've made it this far, it's because you believe that stories of overcoming and justice still matter. If this narrative touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this message of hope with someone who needs to remember that even in the most difficult situations, there's always a way to find strength and purpose.